Hello and welcome to Maqala Foresight. This is Mikhail Manasseh, producer and host of the show. A newly created monitoring mechanism launched a report on 10 July 2023 regarding its assessment of the implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement reached 8 months ago in Pretoria, followed by its implementation matrix signed in Nairobi between the Ethiopian federal government and Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. The assessment, conducted by a coalition of regional and international civil society organizations, revealed disturbing evidence that implementation of the agreement is marred by significant gaps in impacting the protection of civilians. Dismas Nkunda, Executive Director of Atrocities Watch Africa, talking about the launch, said, "The report reveals that it is dangerous to claim that Ethiopia is now at peace." Dismas Nkunda is here with me today to shed more light on the report. Dismas Nkunda, welcome to Maqala Foresight.
I'm happy to be here.
Okay, we will talk about the significant gaps detailed in the report in a bit, but I would like you to comment on another inherent gap. Do you say your attempt, which is the first ever civil society monitoring mechanism of the agreement, is necessitated by this gap?
Partly yes. But the assessment, we started the assessment almost immediate after the signing of the agreement in Pretoria. We had a meeting in which we looked at the agreement, to the cessation of hostilities agreement itself, looked at the gaps, looked at the nature in which it was going to be implemented. We looked at the nature in which the mechanism of its verification would be done, and we got to the level that actually we needed to do this report, which would give us significant, yes. So I was saying that that's the reason why we said that we needed this report in order for us to show that because the Ethiopian government has been celebrating and saying that everything is okay after signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, but we are saying that actually there are still gaps in terms of the civilian protection of civilians. There are still gaps in other areas which we find that the entire Ethiopia is not at peace. The presence of the Eritrean forces which were supposed to leave Tigray, there is no guaranteed access of humanitarian assistance that is required to get into place. So all those are gaps. And if you look at the cessation of hostilities agreement, it could be a nice agreement, but it looks much more like instructions being given to the TPLF instead of an agreement between two people that have a difference that they wanted to settle.
Is your organization, Atrocities Watch Africa, part of the coalition of regional and international civil society organizations that conducted the assessment? Which other organizations were involved?
There are many, there are quite many. There is, for example, there is the International Refugee Rights Initiative, there is the Pan-African Lawyers Union, there is the Africa Leadership Center. There are many, there are quite a number of many. There are other faith-based organizations and think tanks. We collected individuals who have ever monitored ceasefire agreements, mainly in other countries of Africa, who have that experience of being able to share with us. We also got lawyers who are capable of looking at the legal aspects of the cessation of hostilities agreement. So it's a diverse. We are at a minimum, we're about 16 organizations.
Okay. How about the methodologies you used to conduct the assessment, and how comprehensive were they, and the limitations, if any?
Of course, there are limitations. We would have loved to travel to Tigray, to Mekere, and be able to make the assessment of what exactly the monitoring mechanism was doing. We would have loved to speak with the Ethiopian government to be able to let them know that certain aspects of the agreement were not a total celebration for the government to say that everything else is good and nothing there shouldn't be any worry. But of course, we didn't get that chance. But the methodologies we used were, first of all, to correlate information that is in public domain, to be able to speak with humanitarian agencies that are on the ground in Tigray, and also to be able to correlate and do literature review of available, former, the reports that had been made about Tigray and the conflict itself. So it was deep and wide, and took us quite some time to be able to get to the level the kind of report that we put out.
So the agreement is called, the one signed in Pretoria is called Agreement for Lasting Peace Through a Permanent Cessation of Hostilities. So from your findings, what has this achieved over the last 8 months?
It has achieved certain levels of sobriety, so to say that people, I think what we discovered and we looked at was the cessation of hostilities agreement was very welcome to both the central government of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, and also the Tigray. I think they were fatigued by the war, and I think that the kind of violations that had happened, sexual violence against girls and women, the humanitarian corridor, the closure of the banking system, the access to the various IDPs that were not getting the kind of help that was needed, the occupation of schools and school children not going to school. So there was quite a lot of things that were happening at the same time, that this cessation of hostility agreement was a welcome relief for both the belligerent groups. However, with that celebration, we said that it's good that there are elements that show that certain things happened for the good of the country and the Tigrayans, but there are still some lacuna that have not yet been covered, and they're not covered in the agreement. It hasn't stopped other areas like Afar, Amhara, and Oromo for them also to say, if you have this agreement that is one-sided with Tigray, how about us? What happens to us? And so those are elements that are really very strong in terms of other agreements that we have ever seen. I read that agreement. That agreement sounds like an instruction. So it's like someone instructing that do the following things, do the following things. You have 30 days, but some of them much as their instructions, some of them have never been done. For example, the going back of the Eritrean forces, they're still there. They have never left. So you find that there is in the agreement, it's there, but then its implementation is the problem.
So not only non-implementation of the agreement, but there are also reports of new rights violations, continued atrocities happening, as you mentioned, where the Eritrean and Amhara forces are still occupying parts of Tigray. How serious are these gaps, and what's the possibility that they may completely derail the peace process?
If they are not covered, actually in one of our assessments, we had said that possibly there should be an addendum to that agreement, an addendum so that the areas that were not covered sufficiently are given due attention, so that the peace that was sought for is comprehensive, so that it includes the entirety of Ethiopia. Because what we have seen is that the fragmentation, what that cessation of hostilities agreement has done, it has made Ethiopia much more fragmented, because each area thinks you made an agreement with Tigray, you didn't make an agreement with us. And that is something that is really of concern to us, people who want to see that peace returns to Ethiopia.
The report mentions Western Tigray and southern areas of Tigray as remaining outside the scope of the agreement and off limits to independent monitoring. The agreement provides for addressing the dispute regarding these areas based on the constitution. How do you reconcile your claim about Western Tigray and southern areas of Tigray as being outside the scope of the agreement with this provision of the Pretoria agreement?
I think there was no specificity about those particular two places. And our view was that even Tigray itself, you needed to have a totality of it in order for someone to address its problems. So if those certain areas even remained outside the parameters of the agreement, it leaves you to wonder how narrow it was in nature in looking at the conflict in Tigray. So it's that narrowness that we need it to be open, so that we include other areas and everybody, and then it can stem the kind of violence that has persisted, particularly the one on sexual violence against women and girls.
So you mentioned that there are still Eritrean forces in Tigray, that there are also Amhara forces, the Amhara special forces and militia in parts of Tigray. So the federal government is supposed to enforce implementation of the provision of the agreement regarding the pull out of foreign and non-ENDF, which is the Ethiopian National Defense Force, from parts of Tigray territory, particularly western and southern Tigray. And by the way, there are some areas of eastern and northwestern Tigray in which Eritreans have still the hold. Why do you think the federal government is not moving in that direction?
So that's one of the gaps that we identified, Michael, because we thought that if you look at the argument, it says that the foreign troops must withdraw immediately out of Tigray. But we don't know what kind of other agreement the Federal Republic of Ethiopia had with the Eritreans when they came in the first place to stem the violence. So we don't know what kind of agreement they had, and whether the resistance of the Eritreans to leave has a blessing from Addis Ababa. So it's that thing that we are finding, that if the Eritreans were told to leave, why can't they be enforced and they leave? And that's one of the things that we were recently asking the monitoring and evaluation mechanism to be able to say, why don't you enforce the Eritreans to be able to leave Ethiopia as agreed in the cessation of hostilities agreement? So we don't know what kind of other politics that the central government of Ethiopia is playing by leaving the Eritreans and not agreeing to the provisions of the agreement.
The fact that the federal government, which is entitled to implement the leaving of the pullout of the forces, is dragging its feet, and that the answer that you just gave me is suggesting that there may be some hidden agreement that is hampering this from implementation. Is that what you are
that's
suggesting?
what I'm saying. I'm saying what exactly is it making? Why would the Eritrean, we're aware that there is an agreement in place in which they're supposed to leave the territory of Ethiopia? Why are they still there? Is this an agreement between the ENDF and the Eritreans so that they stay to accomplish certain tasks which they had agreed with them? And that's the question. That's the very big question that the Ethiopian government has not been able to answer.
So you don't rule out the possibility that there may be some, secret agreement behind that is hampering.
How else, under what law then would the Eritreans would they have stayed if they didn't have any blessings from the federal government of Ethiopia?
Okay, the federal government has not also implemented other aspects of the provision, like the DDR. Although we have seen the Tigrayan forces handing over heavy weapons, the federal government is supposed to take charge of the whole DDR process. Integrating the forces into the army or demobilizing them into civilian life. Creating jobs for those that are going to be demobilized and all that. We haven't seen any movement in this direction.
There are many things that have not been done, and we don't know whether they are actually being done on purpose to water down the cessation of hostilities agreement. I think one of the most crucial one, which was very important, was the DDR, as you mentioned, Michael. But the slowness with which the government of Ethiopia is not implementing that also leaves you to question whether there was sincerity in terms of this cessation of hostilities agreement and the manner in which it was signed, because DDR is very important for the restoration of a certain level of confidence within Tigray. But if it's not being implemented on time, then what happens in terms of those ones who were soldiers and they have agreed that there is a peace process that is going to make them get reintegrated into the national forces? So as you raised it, Michael, it's a very, very pertinent question, and the lack of an answer is an answer in itself.
If you can highlight some of the abuses that have been going on in parts of Tigray, especially western Tigray, southern parts of Tigray, and even eastern and northwestern parts of Tigray, which are occupied by the Eritreans. By the way, the AU monitors have reported that they were not allowed to visit some of these areas in eastern Tigray, particularly Europe locality. So these continued abuses, from your findings, what have you learned?
Yeah, of course, like we said earlier, we documented that there are certain abuses that have continued. And the particular one that was very worrying is sexual violence against women and girls. There was, of course, enforced disappearance. There was the question of taking over people's property without due compensation. There was the question of the Ethiopian government freezing the banking system. There is the lack of food, as it were, because the famine had become a big problem, in particular after World Food Program. They discovered that the food meant for the internally displaced people had been sold on the market. So there are many continuing violations that are happening, and that is a very serious worry that any person who is interested in a peaceful coexistence between Tigrayans and other Ethiopians will worry about.
The report also identified, problems, lack of durable solutions to IDP problems, and the lack of awareness of the pressure they are in, and the fact that they don't have legal status. So, what do you mean by what are you talking about here when you say legal status?
Legal status is the recognition that is given to them by international legal instruments. So you find that, like, for example, the IDPs in Tigray, they are not considered as people in need of assistance, like the refugees, for example, who crossed the international border, like the Eritreans who crossed over into Sudan. So, but they remain in legal limbo, because the government doesn't recognize them. They don't get the same humanitarian access that other vulnerable groups are getting. So they are being in limbo, in a legal status, without any legal status. Then they don't get the kind of assistance that other people get, and that is where the problem. We are saying that the IDPs need special recognition, and in particular, they are the ones who because if you look at some of the IDPs and where they live in schools, and some of these schools are it has made it very difficult for students to come back to study, because the main schools where they study from have been taken over by IDPs. So there is a problem in terms of the management of the question of IDPs in Tigray.
As I briefly mentioned in the introduction, you are quoted by the media as saying that the report reveals that it is dangerous to claim that Ethiopia is now at peace. Would you like to shed more light on this, and particularly who is making those claims, despite the fact that there is worrying situation on the ground?
The celebration that happened the moment the cessation of hostilities agreement happened, Michael. I was recently in Addis Ababa, and even the African Union itself, they celebrated and said this is the most peaceful, the easiest and the quickest agreement that they have gotten. They have been able to harness. They're comparing it to other agreements on the continent, and they're saying, they are just thumping and saying that it is a very good work. Yes, we say it's very good because it brought some semblance of people to start having conversations and a bit of relief. But we are saying that when the government of Ethiopia recently even gave out awards in what they were saying that they are celebrating that peace has finally come to Tigray. And that's why we are finding that there is a lacuna, there is a problem, because total peace has not come. We have just been discussing about the continued violations that are happening. We are discussing the IDP, the sexual violence, the failure of the verification and monitoring group to reach certain areas. Why do you think they don't reach certain areas? Maybe there are still some certain violations that are happening. So our warning is that let's not celebrate quickly. Let's take time to be able to actualize this agreement, and then we can celebrate when total peace has come to the Tigrayan region.
And relate this to the recent, lifting of the restrictions by the U.S. on the Ethiopian government, saying that the violations, human rights violations, have not continued. The U.S., which was a key player in the, behind the screen player in the Pretoria Agreement, they know what's happening on the ground. Why do you think they are, trying to cover up by saying that there is no more human rights violations in Ethiopia?
I think they are very. I think the things that they were very quick, and I think even now they must be really rethinking their previous argument. Of course, they were heavily involved in the like you rightly say, in the cessation of hostilities agreement. The United States was very heavily involved, and for them, I think it was a very quick win to show that the success of them leading the negotiation in Pretoria. But I do believe that even now themselves, I mean, we speak to human rights organizations that have a close eye, and many of them are American. They themselves believe that it's way too early to be able to celebrate. So I'm certainly sure that the Americans must be rethinking their strategy and saying, I think we did this too early.
So now what message are you sending, as Africans meet, to assess the situation in Africa? Now in Nairobi, yesterday there was this midterm technical meeting for the AU summit. So what message do you send to the African leaders, to make this work to bring about a lasting peace, as the title of the agreement, says?
I am in Nairobi, and I know that the Africa Union Summit was taking place here. So our messages, as always, which we give them, is that look at the totality of the problems of the country and be able to advise on how best to deal with it. Currently, the Africa Union is besieged with many conflicts, one of them being, of course, the one of Ethiopia. But the Ethiopian one isn't only about Tigray, like I said. It is also other areas, and the question of national unity that has not been as perfect as it should be in Ethiopia, and also the other running conflict zones. Sudan, as you are aware, is another one that is having problems. So, but the question is, why then has the African Union not been able to intervene in the conflict in Sudan? But the role the African Union played into the Tigray and Ethiopia was lukewarm in the beginning. I remember us arguing and saying, the African Union needs to have robust intervention, and there were accusations of saying that the African Union is not doing enough simply because the African Union is based in Addis Ababa. And for us, that is a no-go area. You need to intervene, whether it is you are based in Addis Ababa or not, as long as there is a conflict that is causing human rights violations and it's violating the rights of the peoples of Africa. The African Union has to intervene.
Dismas Nkunda, Executive Director of Atrocities Watch Africa. Thank you for this elaborate and very insightful. And to our dear viewers, thanks for watching, and goodbye.